Welcome to City Future Research Center Seminar Series. First, I would like to acknowledge that you're meeting today on the traditional lands of Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, and any First Nation person who is meeting us today. So if you're joining us online, please mute yourself and turn off your cameras. And when we get to the Q&A, you can unmute yourself and turn your cameras back on. I would like to hand it over now to Professor Hausen to introduce our speaker today.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for that, Fatima. Welcome to everyone who's in the room or in the virtual room. And I'm joining from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and paying my respects to elders past and present as well. And very pleased also to welcome back Jin to he's in his LinkedIn post, he's called it his alma mater, which is a posh way of saying Jin did his PhD between 2017 and 2021 at City Futures or UNSW, supervised by myself, but also Professor Hun Han and Bing Chin Lee as well. And we're very pleased to welcome Jin back. Jin, in fact, I would look back. Jin's correspondence with me started in 2016. In fact, it's almost 9 years ago. And then he, after he'd worked, he arrived here in 2017 and worked under that supervision team I mentioned. He was almost on the point of completing his PhD in his thesis in late 2019. And he'd been focusing on Shanghai. That was the empirical part of the thesis, and had been back to Shanghai, his hometown, a couple of times during the research. And he went back for a final short visit at the end, where he was just a few months away from submitting the PhD. Well, he thought it would be a short visit, but actually it turned out not to be so, because and there was extremely unfortunate timing in a way, because Jim was all set to return to Sydney around about the 30th of January, but on the 1st of February the border was closed because COVID arrived. So Jin found himself stranded in Shanghai, and in the end, of course, that situation was there for 2 years. We didn't know it was going to take as long as that, but Jin immediately, apart from finishing the thesis and submitting it online during 2020, also diverted himself to working on some journal articles related and unrelated to the thesis. And today's presentation comes out of that. So that's a long-winded way of saying that this paper came about in a slightly unplanned, I think, way, but it was a really impressive example of making the best of a bad situation. So thanks very much for putting my name on the title slide here, Jin. I don't think I really deserve that. The presentation is really all yours. But thanks for that anyway. What we'll do now is I'll hand over to you, and hopefully you'll be able to complete in about 35-40 minutes, and there should be a few minutes left for discussion at the end. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Han. Thanks for the warm introduction. I actually started in 2016 for PhD. Yes. Thanks for colleagues, for my supervisors. I must first want to express my gratitude to all the support I received in City Futures, in Faculty of Built Environment, School of Built Environment now, in the past decade. And without these supports, I couldn't have achieved what I have now. And today I will introduce the research we did in 2020 when I was stranded in Shanghai and I could not come back. So this is a byproduct of being stranded in Shanghai. And It has recently been published in Housing Studies with my former PhD supervisor, Professor Hao Paulson. And it is discussed how COVID has disrupted China's tenure neutrality initiative, which was proposed and introduced before COVID. So in the very beginning, of the COVID, I think scholars they anticipated that the COVID-19 may exacerbate pre-existing inequalities because of these unjust impacts of the anti-pandemic measures. And renters, most of them are socio-economic disadvantaged cohort. They were disproportionately affected by hardships compared to homeowners. And these could include evictions, job loss, food insecurity, and mental distress. And China is famous for its zero COVID policy, and this was facilitated through its strong government intervention and thanks to its centralized and authoritarian regime. And the initial outbreak was brought to control very quickly at that time when I was in Shanghai. But although this became much more controversial at the later stage. And up to now, I think the comprehensive understanding of the social costs related to the anti-COVID measures is lacking. And we know something about the curtailed privacy and freedom of movement, but we know very little about its impact on the housing system. And government actions systematically favoring property owners over renters likely exacerbated pre-existing tenure inequalities. So the central question here is how tenure inequality in urban China aggravated during pandemic, especially given detrimental effect on tenants' housing security due to government anti-pandemic measures. And I think we need to go through some concepts first. These are two related concepts, tenure inequality and tenure neutrality. So tenure inequality refers to differences in housing rights and also the financial welfare associated with occupancy in different tenures. And housing policy usually targets one specific tenure, although it may have some domino effects. And this may exacerbate or ameliorate inequality. And back to 1980s, Jin Zhu put forward the concept of tenure neutrality, referring to the policy settings facilitating equal treatment for different forms of housing. So it focuses on the housing policy side and mentioned that policy should place housing tenure options on a comparable footing through first is equalizing housing subsidies across tenures and also equalizing residents' housing rights on security of tenure and freedom of mobility and disposal. Unfortunately, I think even before COVID, across the globe, we have seen a widening gap between the owning and renting. And this is particularly accentuated by specific policies. For example, the tax advantaging of home ownership, as in Australia, the tax setting incentivizing investment, and also tenure security in the private rental sector was is maintained inherently inferior to home ownership. I think this is quite common in liberal democratic countries, and also because of the arguments for leveling down social rental rights to the private rental norms. As Jacobs and Manzi mentioned, that housing policies in many countries can tend to sustain the privilege of affluent households rather than to ameliorate the conditions experienced by marginalized communities. But in China, private renting is something new because this is a new tenure type after the housing reform. That before 1980s, actually, private renting was very limited and underdeveloped. For urban residents, they lived in government-provided housing, actually by their employers, their state-owned enterprises. And for rural residents, like myself, I was born in rural Shanghai, and my grandfather built the house, and we still lived there. And then home ownership was promoted and has been promoted as lifestyle and investment products. And from the demand side, I think mass urbanization stimulates house prices and inflation in large cities, and compounded by intercity migration. And this is also embedded in China's land finance model because of the leasehold system and the public land ownership structure. So governments, they have the motivation to get more land revenue from such kind of developments. Until 2021, there are 200 million Chinese people now tenants, and it has become an important type of tenure in big cities, and most of them are migration receive nodes. For example, Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing. So, and when we talk about renting in China, it's always closely associated with migration. However, it has been maintained as a very precarious tenure, and these limitations and vulnerabilities include, first is the rental regulations are set very owner-oriented, and some facts like bonds managed by landlords themselves rather than public authority, and no grounds eviction remain permitted. And for tenants, usually they have limited access to public amenity, and access to public school often tied to property ownership. The vulnerability was compounded by the intersection of housing status and hukou rights in accessing social welfare. But things changed a bit better now, and social welfare only accessible in localities where people's hukou is registered. Then since 2017, some local governments started to propose granting tenants equality with homeowners. This initiative began in Guangdong, so in Guangzhou first, and then it escalated to national policy. So part of the effort in attracting migrants in the context of labor shortage, actually from 2010, then I think Chinese are typically face the problem of a labor shortage because aging and now low fertility rates issues are very significant in China. And the new tenure neutrality initiative focuses mainly two fields. First is to emphasize contractual terms of tenancy agreements, for example, to stabilize these periods and control unreasonable rental increase. But of course, they have no definition what is reasonable or unreasonable. And equalize entitlement to public services for homeowners and tenants. But it has some progress, but it's very limited, I can say, because the good school places are always limited, and tenants only relegated to the lowest priority tier for public school place allocation. But this has been escalated to a national policy because it is in line with the President Xi's famous slogan that housing for living, not for speculation. Then things changed after COVID. I think after COVID, it is really well recognized that housing served as a frontline defense against COVID. Because when lockdowns are enforced, then home working or schooling prevailed. And without government protection, some pre-existing precarities and any inequality amplified. And renters are more likely to face more challenging in housing payments because most of them, they are more likely to be situated in precarious or unemployment situations. And they also the social isolation issues exacerbated by poor housing conditions. And as as shown in many research reports, like one done by City Futures, like by How, many advanced country governments, they have such responses, why they included for first is income protection measures, social security payments, and the second is eviction moratoriums and rent increase restrictions. But unfortunately, no targeted assistance offered for vulnerable groups in the housing market in China, the private renters. The zero COVID policies mainly include lockdowns, massive testing, and mobility restriction. And Gaupt and Mittling and the Global South context, they argued that the pandemic likely led to an amplification of pre-existing inequalities, persecutions, and structural failures. I think this is something happening in China during COVID. In terms of research methods, first we have some desktop analysis of some published official statistics and government pandemic measures in different cities. We also managed, myself, I did some interview during the COVID when I was stranded in Shanghai, and I interviewed some tenants, 26 tenants, 9 landlords, and 3 local officials in local communities. But as I was stranded in Shanghai, I can't travel intercity. So we utilized a leaving a message platform that is established by the central government. So individuals can leave their complaint there, and local governments, they are required to respond in a timely manner. And this can effectively broaden our research scope beyond case study areas. The research findings, I won't go through all the details, but firstly, this is a summary. I think during China's pandemic, aggravated tenure inequality existed in the 4 dimensions. First is the financial hardship and relevant state assistance. And the state assistance towards the owners and renters are quite different and quite contrasting. And second is about whether the tenants face more difficulty in securing their occupancy. And third one is more about local neighborhood accessibility, because when lockdowns enforced, this is very important. And the fourth aspect is more about resource distribution. And this is particularly important at the very beginning of the pandemic, when China faces the shortage of these resources. And this is also associated with the risk of infection. So the first dimension is about financial hardships and relevant state assistance. Tenants were particularly vulnerable due to high incidence of precarious employment. In 26 tenants, more than half of them are informal workers, so they can be easily laid off without proper compensations. And operations in manufacturing and low-end services suspended as guided by the government. And as one tenant interviewee mentioned, the boss just told them to wait patiently until the factory was allowed by the government to reopen. And the stringent lockdown, well, it had disproportionately impacted tenants because it is impossible for people in the manufacturing or low-end services sectors to work from home. So they were actually at a higher risk of losing their jobs. But the state support to tenants and mortgage homeowners are quite contrasting. For renters, in general, there was no substantial assistance. We can say that no moratorium on rent increases or evictions, and no rent assistance for low-income tenants, and no government-guided rent variation. And what the state did is, and through some formal media channels, they did encourage voluntary rent reduction offered by landlords, and they were recognized as morally commendable. But and this is comparable to the findings in the New Zealand case that such kindness, such individual landlord's kindness can be individualized, variable, and temporary. And in our study, many landlords, they were reluctant to reduce rents, and some even invested on full payments or even increased rents. And why should we bear the losses of tenants and we didn't obtain the property for free? And in our case, we did find about one or two landlords who voluntarily offer such rent reduction. These are in the peri-urban villages setting because the landlords build these houses by their own. So actually they do not have to pay mortgages or other costs associated. By contrast, we can see the government provided very concrete and decisive assistance to mortgage owners. So on the 1st of February 2020, so that was just 1 week after Wuhan lockdown. So the first lockdown, just after 1 week, the Reserve Bank, China's People's Bank, and several ministries issued guidelines to allow mortgage owners to postpone their mortgage repayments. It is not difficult to perceive the state's imperative to stabilize the financial sector, as seen elsewhere. But tenants, they did face very severe affordability issues. The second dimension is whether they can secure their occupancy. As I mentioned earlier, so renting in China is closely associated with domestic migration. So if you are a migrant tenant, so perhaps you are mobile populations, then you may be perceived as possible various carriers. So this wrong perception make tenants hard to secure their occupancy during the crisis. And before the lockdown of Wuhan, the first lockdown is 23rd of January. And actually, millions of migrants already, they had left for family gathering to celebrate Chinese New Year. And like myself, I also went back at that time before Wuhan lockdown. So then other provinces and cities, they feel very worried about that. They try their best to prevent the influx of people from pandemic-stricken cities, but this had led to increased scrutiny of migrant tenants. And we find that right to occupancy actually was just secondary to pandemic control measures. And tenants, they may ask by the local government or landlord to defer their return. Like one landlord mentioned, my tenant is still in his hometown but wants to come back. However, that means neighborhood committee is the lowest tier of state, and asked me to notify him to stay rather than move until the situation is better controlled. And if they fail to comply with such requests, they were often regarded as morally irresponsible. And this kind of place-based stigmatization is, of course, it's wrong perception, but it significantly impacted tenants' ability to secure shelter during the pandemic, especially people from Hubei. Hubei is where Wuhan is located. Wuhan is the provincial capital of Hubei. So regardless of their travel history, as one landlord mentioned, a young couple said they wanted to rent the room and move in following week. I don't know who told the village committee, but in the evening they called me and said, I'm not allowed to receive new tenants, especially from that province. Also, landlord-initiated evictions became common. Some of them, they may worry about the potential risks of being infected, but many of them, they were guided by local governments to do so. And of course, then there was lack of state intervention in landlord-initiated evictions. And in some circumstances, although relatively rare, there were also some state-initiated evictions. So, for example, in the February, also in the very beginning of the pandemic, and some non-local tenants living in apartment buildings evicted by street committee. So that is also the lowest tier of the government. And people launched complaints on the platform, but not addressed by higher level governments. So we can detect the localism approach in because all the localities, they try their best to minimize COVID cases in their jurisdictions, and so that they can avoid potential political blame from higher authorities. So these anti-pandemic measures and the anti-pandemic performance became highly politicized in this setting. And the third dimension is more about local neighborhood accessibility. So when you want to reduce mobility, then you always need to do so. And in Chinese setting, in urban areas, gated communities are common. So it is easy to implement such kind of control. But for rural areas, so these villages were fenced off, and they will leave 1 or 2 access points open with security checking temperature and identity. So the left one is an urban community, and the right one is a rural village. And they also issue access permits to control the mobility. So, but only those who fit specific standards. For example, they have no symptom of COVID, and they have remained in the same city for over 2 weeks. However, tenants, they were subject to more onerous monitoring procedures and accessibility regulations than homeowners, because it was difficult for tenants to obtain the government-issued access permits. And as mentioned by one tenant, we need to show our contract, and the landlord will also be required to show up when I apply for the permit. Otherwise, they wouldn't issue the permit. And then we also asked the local official. So he mentioned that, okay, we must have the landlords there to say that the tenant live there. In short, he or she who makes a profit should take responsibility. So this highlights the government desire to transfer the burden to profit-making landlords. And there are also other unreasonable regulations implemented to restrict tenants. For example, in some districts of Beijing, so before COVID, both tenants and owners, they could bring their cars into the village, but then they had some new regulations that only local villagers can drive in, but tenants had to park outside the village. And the complaint launched was also not addressed, because they responded that this is a self-governance issue and they would not intervene. But of course, tenants were not part of the process of this decision making. And the fourth dimension is about resource distribution and risk of infection. As I mentioned at the very beginning, China faced a shortage of public health resources, including face masks, and disinfectants. This was particularly exacerbated because the outbreak began during the Chinese New Year, when all the factories were closed. And then government, they had to allocate limited resources to households at a neighborhood level. But this again has aggravated tenure inequality, because the distribution only guaranteed landlords while neglected tenants, because this was based on hukou. And as one tenant mentioned, sorry, you are not the owner. Okay, the neighborhood cadre told me you are not the owner. The number of masks is limited, and the government only allocates 5 masks for each house. Your landlord talks of so I can't allocate more to this address. And but actually, this makes little sense for pandemic control because the virus itself is tenure neutral, and in some circumstances, the landlord and tenant they live under the same roof, and especially in the peri-urban villages setting. And of course, tenants had to pay higher prices to buy masks until the supply later improved after perhaps 2 months of time. And they of course expressed dissatisfaction. We contribute to the local economy, and so we deserve more support and care from the government. Thus, I think the pandemic itself further aggravated the long-term status of migrant tenants as second-class citizens in host cities. To wrap up a bit, so I just analyzed 4 dimensions of the tenure inequality. First is tenants faced greater risk of financial hardship and stress, but with little or no government assistance. This is in particularly contrasting to what the government offer to homeowners. And big city tenants, they were subject to stigmatization and even eviction from local residents and also communities, the lowest tier of government. And tenants' intention to return that occupancy was also hindered by host city local governments. And China's anti-pandemic strategy disproportionately violated the housing rights, for example, free access of tenants. And but owners, they were in a relatively better position in getting the permits, and tenants were also neglected and regarded as ineligible in government allocation of resources. And the last section is a bit of discussion. So what we learned from the story in China, it is certainly a state-accentuated tenure inequality. And in China, as in many other countries, vulnerable groups often faced greater disadvantages. And sometimes this could be exacerbated by government policies. And private renters hit worse by the crisis, in part due to the lack of emergency government support. And what's worse is that sometimes they face state-initiated evictions. So our findings may echo with some other scholars' finding. For example, Horn and the colleagues mentioned that the management of COVID-19 had exacerbated the unequal situation by providing protection largely to those who already benefited from structural resilience and leaving out those in the grey economy, in marginal housing, and in second-class tenure groups. And as mentioned by Hao and the team, the public health crisis has the effect of crystallizing and compounding many pre-existing sources of inequality and poverty. So, housing rights, the outcome is, what are the outcome? Then housing rights of millions of renters were compromised. And private rental sector was again rendered as a substantially inferior tenure type. So as seen in other countries, this may further accentuate tenants' home ownership aspiration. Because households like to stay in current abode until the mismatch between what the residents can provide and their preferences exceed a certain limit. Of course, what they experienced in the private rental sector was not appealing at all. And then soon after the end of Wuhan lockdown, we can notice a sharp increase immediately after the end of the lockdown. So this is the house price of resale dwellings in China's first-tier cities, and the trend lasted until about 1 year after. So what we observe here is that house price boom here was not a pure market outcome, a trend fueled by government policies that further extended existing tenure inequality. So we of course we have seen the disruption to China's tenure neutrality initiative, and pre-pandemic the government does want to relieve the housing tenure inequality and increase appeal of private rental sector, especially in big cities, which would like to attract more migrants. But what they did during pandemic is poor reactions and strict limitations for tenants, rendering private rental sector rather inferior. So a final page. Housing was at front line of COVID intervention, and government should proactively provide assistance. And this is actually very sensible for government to do so. As in Australia, although it has also been criticized in certain respects, but I think it has made use of the pandemic to narrow the inequality, especially at the beginning, using the social security payments and job keepers to benefit those in the part-time employment. But it is very unfortunate that we did not see any substantial assistance towards the cohort in Chinese anti-pandemic policies. So a final sentence is, I quote Christopher's sentence that the pursuit of tenure inequality is today not a potential policy enhancement so much as increasingly a policy necessity. I think that's it. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Jin. So there's a lot to absorb there, particularly for maybe not for everyone on the call, because I think there's quite a few Chinese scholars on the call. So the very, very different way that the housing system functions in China, and the kind of the inequality of citizenship rights, which I think is very important theme in this paper, or underlying this paper. That's something that people who are living in China or know China, that will be familiar to them. But for the Australian audience, that's something that's really quite hard to get your head around. But an absolutely crucial dimension of this, I think. So maybe I'll just make one or two other comments about the paper or the presentation, and then I'm hoping that there's others in the room who would like to ask a question or make a comment. My first comment is really, Jin, I think we made it. I think we missed an opportunity here, because I think the virus is tenure neutral would have been such a great title for our paper. With a subtitle, of course, but that would be a nice attention grabber, which we failed to realise. But I mean, I think the main thing I'd like you to maybe just say a bit more about is President Xi's famous statement, which you described. I mean, it's probably famous to the Chinese colleagues on the call, but maybe not everyone else from in the Australian audience will be actually aware of that. But this is something that goes back some way, doesn't it? So this isn't something that this is a comment or a kind of a statement that was made before COVID, and really quite a dramatic comment. Houses are for living, not for speculating, or something of that description, isn't it? I mean, when exactly was that? And what do you think lies behind that? And is it something that's repeated, or is it a statement that was made and is kind of been dropped and kind of fallen by the wayside? Back to you, Jin.
Yes. I remember that previously I was sent a review request by Housing Service. There was a paper discussing the housing for living, not for speculation. I think this is when she came into power and he explicitly put forward this slogan. And nowadays in Chinese cities, we notice the back of state in housing provision. So we had the housing reform starting in 1980s, but nowadays, so I think even after the COVID, the government is expanding its public rental sector. For example, they use this initiative also to address the unfinished housing projects issues. Now the governments, some governments buy these properties and they use it for the state-owned affordable rental housing, they call it. And I think this slogan manifested the state's ambition to step back to the housing provision. And with some supply in the government's hands, then it is easier to stabilize the housing market. I think this is something under the slogan. Yeah.
Thank you, Jin. Who else would like to ask a question, make a comment? You could type it in the chat if you would prefer not to unmute yourself and speak it. But who would like? Okay. Do pose your question.
Yeah, Hazel.
Thanks. Thanks, Jin. That was really interesting. I was especially interested by the graph that showed the huge rise in prices after the end of the lockdown. And I was just wondering, is there data available on the purchases of properties during that period? Like, do you know how many of the purchases of properties during that period had hukou from outside the area, or how many were buying as landlords or owners, owner-occupiers?
We know the number of transactions, but actually we can't tell who are originally renters, so that's very unfortunate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's interesting to
it would be great to know if you could.
Yes.
Yeah. I have a question, Richard. So you mentioned that the majority of renters are people who have internal migration, essentially.
Yeah.
And that pre-1980 there wasn't as much of a private rental market. Is that to suggest that pre-1980 people who migrated internally were able to secure public housing, or there just wasn't as
before the reform? Actually, people were not allowed to migrate.
Okay.
Yes, it's then people allowed to migrate after the reform.
Yeah.
Actually, they back to 1978, I think. Yeah. So yes, it's so private renting at that time was very limited and rare.
And is there still options for people who migrate internally to get public housing?
Public housing, and this is a local welfare, and it is very city specific. I think some cities they are more inclusive to provide public housing to non-local population, like Chongqing or Shenzhen. These cities, but they are doing very well because they recognize the potential of the inclusion to attract more migrants to contribute to local economies. Yeah.
Did you see the same problems with public housing versus private housing? Were they the same issues, or was the public housing?
Public housing, I think they were better looked after by the government.
So can you just clarify, Jin, whether to get a public housing tenancy, you must have local hukou?
As I mentioned, this is very city specific. So basically, I can say yes, they need local hukou, but some cities they are more inclusive to provide public housing also to non-hukou populations like Shenzhen and Chongqing, as I mentioned. So they realize that it is very important to attract migrants through that way. Yeah, and also, but they may only target more skilled migrants.
Yeah.
Not all migrants. Yeah.
So it could be part of the economic development strategy, really.
Yeah. So this is certainly the development welfare regime in East Asia. Yeah.
Who else would like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'd just like, it's Bill here, I'd just like to pick up on Hazel's point about that big increase in values after COVID, which, Howell, you can chip in here because you know more about this than I do, but we had the same trend here.
Yes.
And yet the housing markets are so incredibly different. I mean, that's the sort of thing that kind of stands out. Well, if the same thing happened in Australia as happened in China. Is there an explanation of what happened in China in terms of pushing those prices up during COVID and post COVID? Is there a literature on this that we can look at? Because I'm not sure how. You may know more about it than I do, but it didn't strike me that anybody really explained why it happened in Australia.
Well, I think to a large degree because of interest rates going down to almost zero. I mean, they were already pretty low. They were quite low already before the pandemic, but when COVID struck, they were cut back even further and to 0.5% or something of that nature. I don't. Jin, can you tell us? Was there a similar central bank policy in China that might have had a similar effect?
I think interest rates, well, yes, and recently the rates increased significantly. So I think, but in the period after the COVID, after the Wuhan lockdown, I think it was kept still very low. So it also stimulates home buying behaviors. Yeah.
But just following up, it'd be interesting to if you could get what Hazel was saying was the huge the demand that happened, which pushed prices up. Did it come from an investor market or from a home buyer market? I know the Chinese residential sector has got into real difficulties in the last 3 or 4 years post COVID. It'd be interesting to know what the dynamic of that was. Anyway,
Yes, I think we need to look at the story after the data. Yeah, so especially the source of these, the profile of these buyers, but this might be very difficult to get. I mean, the data in China. Yeah.
Pretty difficult to get here. So,
just got a door on 47,000 people.
Yes.
Yes.
Jin, do you think there's been any sort of consequence of the way that renters were treated during the pandemic? The inequality that you've described in the paper, or we maybe have described in the paper. Is there any? Can you sort of point to any after effects of that in terms of people becoming perhaps more, identifying as oppressed, having an oppressed housing situation and demanding more rights?
Yes, I think one thing is doing interviews. Some people, especially in urban setting, not the rural urban village setting, they explicitly stated that they they would like to buy if they can, and they were actually fed up with all the experience in the rental sector during the COVID. And also I interviewed some real estate agents, and they also mentioned that some rationales are behind their home buying behaviors, but these are a bit indirect, but evidence. Yeah.
Because we've seen the develop or the evolution of rental regulation in Australia in the period overlapping with COVID, but especially since COVID, where several state and territory governments have actually reformed their residential tenancies acts, and they've provided significantly increased rights to tenants over the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, a lot of people would say it doesn't go far enough, but it certainly is a change from the way that things were set up in most parts of Australia up until 2020. I mean, most of that probably didn't come about because of people were on the streets demanding it, but maybe public pressure in that was some factor that has helped to bring those things about. Obviously, it's very hard to translate those sorts of or to imagine that those kinds of dynamics could occur in a more autocratic government or under a more autocratic government like China. But are there any parallels there?
I think at the moment, it's because the rental regulations not like Australian states and territory governments, and the tenure neutrality initiative, as I mentioned, was something before COVID, and this actually does not change, hasn't been changed until now. And so what we concluded here is what they experienced during the COVID. Of course, the residents in the PRS, of course, can't satisfy their demand, and they originally thought maybe it's good to be a renter, but the COVID experience just told them it's impossible for you to have a secure shelter. So this is what we get from the interview, the conclusion. So
redoubling the appeal of home ownership because being a renter is such a bad deal.
Yes. And
Alan has a question. Can you unmute yourself?
Thanks, Hal.
Come on.
Can you get me?
Yeah.
Hi, Jin. I wanted to ask, moving away from renters, I mean, can you tell us a bit about the landlords? You know, in Australia, people talk about mom and dad landlords. I mean, who are the landlords in China? Are they very wealthy individuals? Do they own a string of properties? Maybe if you could just give us some idea.
Yes, the landlords in this context, I think it's quite diverse. So I have 3 cases in this paper. So one in urban setting, so it might be an investor landlord, but in the peri-urban setting, it's as I said, some landlords they live under the same roof with tenants, so they are actually not very wealthy people, of course. So it's very diverse.
The term resident landlord used to be used to describe that model you're just describing there. We hardly ever use that phrase in Australia, I think, but certainly in the UK it used to be quite a significant part of the housing system. And so it's interesting that that also is seen. Alan, do you want to come back on that?
No, I think I'm fine.
Thanks, Alan.
So who else would like to comment or ask a question? Anybody else in the room?
Yeah, it's Rayhan. Arian.
Arian's asking a question.
Yeah, do go ahead.
My question about it, one of your earlier slides, maybe relevant to Alan's point. You said that tenants have more limited access to amenities like public schools.
Yes.
Is that something like because of the geographies of homeowners and renters, or is it a privilege?
It's a privilege of homeowners. And as homeowners, you can register your hukou, that's your citizen status there, but tenants, you can't. And this is just to residents. You can't register your hukou. Hukou is a citizenship right in Chinese setting. So I think after after the tenure neutrality initiative, then tenants children, they can also access to public schools, but prior to that, they could not. So this is actually, as I mentioned, there is some progress, but limited, because these school places are always limited, and they will have the rating system to rate all the applicants, and of course tenants are relegated to very low priority tier of the allocation. Yeah.
So tenants definitely don't have hukou.
They have hukou, but they registered elsewhere. For example, if I'm from Tasmania, I have hukou there. I was born there, and I came to Sydney several years ago, but I still left my hukou there. So you can imagine.
So you can,
and it is possible, Jin, isn't it? It's hukou is something that you can acquire.
You can apply,
but it's not something you can do quickly, and it's not, for some people it's something that they will never get. But some people are able to be migrants who initially don't have any hukou, and therefore they can only be renters, and they may not be able to get some services. But in some cases, hukou can be acquired in the city that they've lived in. How does that happen?
Yes, and this is similar to if you want to apply for permanent resident here, so you need to meet certain criteria, education, your skill. They will rate you if you achieve something. Okay, we can grant you. Yeah.
Other questions?
Just a quick follow-up on that one.
Yeah.
Can you not buy a house in a city unless you have hukou in that city?
This is a good question. So they have a purchase limitation policy that in many cities you need to have a hukou before you buy this property, or otherwise, if you don't have hukou, you have worked here for at least 3-5 years with social security payment every year, with tax payment every year, then you are eligible for home buying. Yeah, so different cities, they have different restrictions.
But it may be possible to buy a house by a lower quality or a lower form of home ownership. Isn't that right, Jin? This is another paper that Jin's published.
Yes.
Which is to do with a kind of second class form of home ownership. Which, Hazel, you might agree that this is true of apartment owners, but this is there's some similarity with this in the Chinese situation, that this second class form of home ownership has been opened up to some migrants without hukou in certain cities, and it's caused a lot of problems that are described in the other paper that Jin's published that I'm talking about. Do you want to say more about that, Jin?
Oh, yes. So that's about the converted housing. So in China, so commercial land is often oversupplied, and then developers they just converted these commercial properties to residential apartments. So these properties, they are still labeled as commercial. So even you do not have hukou, you can still buy. And usually you can also, because it has usually it has a relatively high floor height, 4.5 meters. So you can convert it into a 2-floor apartments. So this is quite prevalent in first-tier cities, Shanghai.
Yeah, so it's a kind of a nuance to the general idea that home ownership is something that's only available to people with hukou. This is a sort of grey area between the two.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. It's possible for Westerners to own property in China, isn't it, or not?
For what?
Westerners.
Foreigners. Foreigners, they can.
But when they die, it cannot be passed to their family outside the country, can it?
I think I have to say I have very limited knowledge on this, but I know that foreigners can buy. So foreigners can buy housing, even you do not have the hukou. And whether your children can inherit it, I think you can. Yeah, I think it could be. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
We've actually just exceeded we've just actually gone past 5 o'clock. So I think we should be drawing it to a close. If there's anyone who wants to make one last comment or ask one last short question, otherwise we'll maybe just say thanks very much to Jin and hopefully everyone has found that an interesting presentation.
I was going to say we might have to have Jin back again because it seems to stimulate a lot of discussion.
Thank you. Yeah.
He's coming back in February, so
And March.
March. Oh dear.
I'm a frequent senior business.
So thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks to Jin, and we'll be resuming the seminar series in T1 next year.